It's started.
Okay, here we go. Good evening, everyone. My name is Janet Hauser, and I'd like to welcome you to Hari's December event. Tonight, we have Sato Moughalian speaking with us about the book that she has written. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about her, since I also know her personally. Sato Moughalian is a woman of many talents. She is an accomplished professional flutist, the artistic director of the Perspectives Ensemble. She has produced many CDs, and she is also a skilled researcher. After intensive research and interviews undertaken on several continents, she completed a biography of her grandfather, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2019, entitled A Feast of Ashes, The Life and Art of David Ohannessian. The book is currently being translated into Turkish, and Sato has lectured at a wide variety of venues, including universities from the East Coast, such as Columbia University and Brandeis, to the West Coast, UCLA, USC, Berkeley, UC Davis, and from Europe, the London SOAS, to museums such as the Benaki Museum in Athens, to Hong Kong at the International Literary Festival. She is currently working on a second book. And with that, one more thing. Sato asked if any of the participants in tonight's event would like to share any ceramics that they have in their possession. She would welcome you to do that at the end of her talk when we have questions and answers. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sato.
Thank you so much, Janet. I really appreciate this opportunity that you've given me and Martha and Margaret to speak for the Armenian Historical Association of Rhode Island. And it's lovely in particular to be speaking in the calendar of Advent. So thank you for having me. It's just a privilege to be able to speak, to share the story of Jerusalem's Armenian ceramics tradition. This is an art that had its roots in Ottoman Anatolia, and it was transferred to post-World War Palestine in the person of my maternal grandfather, David Ohannessian. His work really changed the face of Jerusalem, as we will see, and he left behind an artistic tradition that's beloved by a large public that links his distinctive art with the urban fabric of the Holy City. But even in this affection for Armenian Jerusalem ceramics, the central fact of how this art actually got to Jerusalem has basically remained untold. And in thinking about this gap, especially over this last very fraught, couple of years with not only COVID, but the terrible war in Artsakh, I've been thinking about larger questions like, how do we Armenians, as well as other global diasporic communities, make our voices heard in the context of the societies in which we live? And what happens when other people frame our histories? I wonder, is there a particular power to Armenians telling their own stories? And how many stories still wait to be told? I suspect a lot. So to take one example that reflects on several of these questions, let's zoom back to Aleppo, Syria, for a moment and look at a few images. It's late November of 1918. 1 month earlier, British Major General James McAndrew and his 5th Cavalry Division had driven the Ottoman Turkish troops out of Aleppo. Days later, Talat Pasha and Enver Pasha fled Constantinople in a German submarine, seeking shelter in Berlin. Aleppo was the last in a series of conquests that would lead to the signing of the Mudros Treaty on October 30th, which marked the Ottoman surrender of its Arab territories. So here we see a kind of triumphalist British scene as the British represented it. General Edmund Allenby, his entry into Aleppo after its capture from the Ottoman Turks. So have a look at that. During the war, Aleppo, as you know, had functioned as a way station in the genocidal deportation of hundreds of thousands of Armenians expelled from Anatolia toward their likely deaths in the Syrian desert. And here, of course, we see this Armenian National Institute map. The larger the circle, the greater number of murders and deaths. And in red, we see Aleppo. In late 1918, some 50,000 Armenian refugees remained in Aleppo. And here's one photo that I find very, very poignant, preserved in the Nubarian Library in Paris. You see these people who have suffered unimaginable horrors weaving, trying to make a life for themselves, beautifully captured in this photograph. But here's a different kind of image. And this is an image that we also need to kind of center in our narratives of that period. So here we see members of Aleppo's Armenian humanitarian network. And these individuals had quietly marshaled every possible resource to resist the waves of violence, hunger, infectious disease that continued to decimate the city's refugees throughout the war years. In this photo, in this very beautiful, dignified photo, we see Armenian agency and self-help. This is a dramatic story that has recently been brilliantly documented in Khachik Muradian's new book called The Resistance Network, which I also very highly recommend everyone take a look at. So on November 28, 1918, the British government, represented by Sir Mark Sykes, set up a provisional administration in a large rented house in Aleppo. And Armenians lined up for days, anxious to convey their stories, to report on the ongoing violations of the new armistice agreements. And for 4 days and nights, Mark Sykes and his staff took sworn testimonies from these survivors. Some of the witnesses were orphaned children, others were representatives of Armenian deportee communities, committees who had gathered statistics despite the very, very chaotic, trying conditions. One group of elders had formulated demands for Armenian political autonomy, for reparations, and many individuals deposited handwritten memoirs of their long ordeals, which were filled with vivid details, names of officers who had abused, robbed them, killed their relatives, accounts of how many from this village or that village had been slaughtered, like very, very specific accounts under sworn testimony. And all of these Armenians were asking that their voices be heard, that their stories be communicated to the larger world. They were not passive, they were not quiet, they had agency, they were asking, demanding to be heard. And in the space of these 4 days, they presented their cases to the British, leaving behind sheaves of written records. And you see some of these records here. Why am I telling you this? 2 reasons. First, because these voices, all these Armenian stories, so painstakingly recorded, never reached their intended audiences. Because within weeks, Mark Sykes would die of influenza in the great epidemic of 1918-19 before he completed his mission. So these passionate and urgent accounts that were filled with so much vital information, dates, names, numbers, places, they still remain largely untouched in his archive, like countless other contemporaneous Armenian testimonies in other archives around the world. Often they are sidelined by non-Armenian historians who've argued that because they were written by members of a so-called victim group, that they could not possibly constitute valuable or reliable historical documents because of a lack of objectivity. Thankfully, scholars such as Bedros Dermatosyan, Aras Rafyan, Vahe Tashjan, Khachik Muradian, Asya Darbinian have been arguing forcefully against this view. Now, reason number 2 why I'm telling you all of this is because in late November of 1918, among these long lines of Armenians waiting patiently to meet with members of this new provisional British administration was my own grandfather, David Ohannessian. At that moment in time, he, my grandmother Victoria, their 3 small children had already endured nearly 3 years as refugees in Syria. And this meeting with Mark Sykes, which I'm very happy to say did actually take place, changed the course of one field of Armenian cultural production as we know it today. Without that meeting, there would not have been the celebrated Armenian ceramics tradition of Jerusalem. But this pivotal moment had remained obscured from the record. So I ask, how many more stories are still hidden in archives? So for me, these archival findings provided the missing pieces needed to understand fully this trajectory, the movement of Armenian ceramics from Ottoman Anatolia to British Mandate Palestine. But of course, I could not have reconstructed the history of the art without the efforts of my family, my mother in particular, and aunts, uncles, cousins, to kind of safeguard pieces of our family's collective heritage. So at the end of my talk, I'm going to relate some extraordinary efforts. Some of you will be familiar with these, all of them or some of them, but some of you may not. There are people who are working very hard to amplify the stories of our history, our peoples, and to preserve narratives for generations to come. So by doing that, I hope to also encourage you, some of you may be interested in writing or doing active work to preserve your own family's heritage. And I greatly encourage this and would do anything I could to help, because these stories tell a part of history in a way that nothing else can. So let's turn to some particulars. So these are my maternal grandparents, Victoria and David Ohannessian. In the years before World War I, Ohannessian was a renowned master of the historic Ottoman Kütahya ceramics tradition. So in early 1916, during the period of the Armenian Genocide, he, my grandmother, and their 3 tiny children were deported from Kütahya towards Syria. And as I had said, after surviving 3 very bleak years, they resettled in Jerusalem in 1918, where my grandfather reestablished his art in 1919. To get a sense of this art, if you're new to it, let's just take a look at some of his most characteristic Jerusalem works. And then I will give you some background on this centuries-old tradition he inherited in Ottoman Anatolia, a glimpse into the sort of political, historic context that played a role in this work. And finally, we'll see just how my grandfather's pre-World War I career, as well as his migration, played a crucial role in the recreation of this tradition and left us this beautiful artistic legacy that continues to flourish in Jerusalem today. His Jerusalem workshop produced pottery as well as tiles, and these are distinguished by intense saturated colors and a mix of opaque and translucent glazes. If you ever walked around the old city, as I know Margaret has many times, you'll have seen these Armenian shops featuring beautiful displays of this colorfully glazed pottery and tile work. And outside the old city, as you walk around, if you look up, you'll see, once you start looking, you'll see everywhere these beautiful blue, green, white tiles adorning the buildings. They provide these splashes of color against Jerusalem's gold building stones. And these are all the work of David Ohannessian. So really, once you start looking for them, you'll see them all around. And in fact, they're such a characteristic part of the cityscape that international film and art directors often use them as a kind of visual shorthand for Jerusalem. Here, some of you may have seen this Hannah Arendt's film that came out in 2012. This is her first day in Jerusalem. She's seated in front of Ohannessian ceramics. Here we have a scene at the luxurious American Colony Hotel with 2 writers, and very often photo sessions there, the photographer will place them in front of Ohannessian ceramics. 2003, the Israeli Postal Service celebrated Armenian ceramics with a series of commemorative stamps. And in 2019, when Feast of Ashes was published, the Palestinian Museum in Birzeit, in the West Bank, produced a conference, a week-long conference about Ohannessian, and they created these beautiful children's activity booklets in both English and Arabic, and they offered these ceramics workshops that the Sandrunis taught, which was beautiful to see these small children painting ceramics. So since the founding of this art in Jerusalem in 1919, it's achieved a global reach with examples in museums, public buildings, and homes all over the world. In 1986, the Ardatz Museum in Tel Aviv organized the first formal museum exhibition of the Armenian pottery of Jerusalem, and kudos to curator Yael Olenek, who recognized it as a distinct art, a separate branch of the larger field of Ottoman ceramics. So as we learned earlier, Ohannessian's career bridged the Kütahya and Jerusalem schools of ceramic making, and each of these 2 had been surveyed by specialist art historians, but almost every account was filled with huge gaps and errors. I understood as his granddaughter that the answer to the question of how the art moved from Kütahya to Jerusalem was directly tied to Ohannessian's arrest and deportation in 1916, but this was a subject that no one seemed to want to discuss. And especially in the writings of the British art historians, Ohannessian was often portrayed as this kind of voiceless, powerless artisan, dependent on, beholden to the benevolence of British Mandate patrons. And although I knew, I never met him because he died before I was born, like I knew from my family that he was a person of enormous drive and intelligence and motivation. I felt that it was my mission to draw a clearer line from the first half of his career to the second, to memorialize his long deportation journey from Kütahya to Aleppo to Jerusalem. So let's look briefly at his early years in Kütahya, learn something about the circumstances of this artistic tradition and the Armenian participation in Kütahya ceramics in the late Ottoman Empire. So just to orient us, here's a map which shows the empire at different phases of its expansion and contraction. The colored regions show its greatest scope, its greatest expanse, which took place at the end of the 17th century. And the red outline that you see, basically, is the Anatolian Peninsula, which circumscribes what is today the modern Republic of Turkey. So a great part of these expansions, these former historic expansions, were due to the conquest of the most familiar of the Ottoman sultans, Suleiman the Magnificent, who also plays a role in the history of Ottoman ceramics. So returning to Ohannessian, he was born in 1884 in the village of Muradça and spent his youth in Eskişehir. And like many rural families, our Gerdastan maintained a strong tradition of storytelling. Knowledge of all the family milestones, marriages, professions, births of children, all of these things were passed down through the generations around the hearth on cold winter nights. So in this way, my young grandfather learned that he was in part descended from men who had traveled to the historic Ottoman Ceramic Center of Kütahya to learn this art. And similarly, my mother, as a child in Palestine, learned the history of her ancestors. So in the last years of her life, she transcribed all these stories and made copies for every member of my generation. And from my mother's account, I learned that in 1902, Ohannessian, at the age of 17, followed in the footsteps of his ancestors, moved to Kütahya, got himself into an apprenticeship. And at that time, 1902, there were two workshops, one owned by a Turkish master, Mehmet Emin, and the other led by the two Armenian brothers, Garabed and Haratun Minasyan. So by 1907, 5 years later, Ohannessian had mastered this art and opened his own studio called the Société Ottomane de Fayence. And here we see his letterhead as I found it in the archive of Mark Sykes. Excuse me. We note three languages, Ottoman Turkish on top, the official language, French, the language of international trade in the Ottoman Empire, and then on the bottom, Armenian, which is a little bit unusual because Kütahya in the interior was a completely Turkish-speaking city. But we get the sense that already in the early years of his career, Ohannessian's career, he was already envisioning international trade for himself. So also to contextualize a little bit more, here we see a tectonic map of Anatolia. You can see how this western region of the Anatolian Peninsula is extremely complex with lots of crashing tectonic plates and fragments. And this complexity gave rise to these very rich deposits of clays and other minerals, which were used over the centuries to produce glazed ceramics, as well as many different distinctive art forms. So at the top red circle, you see the chief imperial ceramic making center of the Ottoman Empire, Iznik, which gave its name to a whole school of ceramic making characterized by very formal styles, repeating floral and geometric patterns, and these catered to the taste of the Ottoman imperial court. Now, 100 miles to the south, we see the second center, Kütahya. Both these regions contain rich supplies of borax, quartz, chrome, cobalt, manganese, and a number of other minerals that were of importance in this art form. Most especially, is the clay called kaolin, which is this kind of soft white china clay that produces this characteristic luminous white background that we see in the very finest Iznik and Kütahya ware. So for the Ottoman court, the acquisition, commission of these intricate labor-intensive works served as an expression and a projection of imperial wealth, power, and taste. And at the height of the Iznik tradition, around the 16th century age of Suleiman the Magnificent, the ceramicists in Iznik were producing these exquisitely refined works, but you also see the influence of Chinese blue and white porcelain. So we have to imagine, you know, all of Asia, we have to imagine like caravans of artisans and tradesmen and business people, merchants traveling along, carrying, transmitting knowledge of these different art forms, exchanging ideas, engaging in commerce, circulating. And in the same way, the Chinese aesthetics circulated west. And you can see more clearly in this side-by-side comparison on the left, you see a Chinese blue and white so-called grapes dish from the early 15th century. And then 1 century later, we see a version of it that's produced in Iznik. Clearly, the influence has traveled from one place to the next. So in the 16th century, the tiles and tiled monuments also took on an important role in the Ottoman Empire. The sultans, other elites, commissioned Iznik tiles for their own future tombs, mosques, and palaces. And here we see the really spectacular tiling of the Rustem Pasha Mosque, which represents the peak of Iznik tile production and was designed by the greatest classical Ottoman architect, Mimar Sinan. Kütahya, with its own mineral wealth, but somewhat farther away from the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, was, as we said, a secondary center, often cooperating with the Iznik workshops and taking on the overflow from large imperial orders. But we also know that from surviving labor agreements and other records that in Kütahya, the trade was historically dominated by Armenian ceramicists who developed some unique, immediately recognizable styles like these coffee pots and cups, playful figural styles, which you immediately know come from Kütahya. And they also produced these Christian votive objects, like the eggs that you see hanging in churches, in particular in Sur Pagop in Jerusalem. You see these Kütahya eggs from over a period of century, this plate with the Archangel Michael. And by the early 18th century, for a variety of reasons, the ceramic production in Iznik had declined, collapsed essentially. And instead, huge commissions were arriving in Kütahya, including orders from Jerusalem's Armenian Patriarchate. Around 1718, the Armenian Patriarchate commissioned a series of Armenian inscribed pictorial tiles illustrating scenes from the Gospels. These were intended for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but they ended up in Sur Pagop. At the same time, throughout these centuries, the renovation of externally tiled monuments throughout Ottoman lands provided work, kept these Kütahya ceramicists going. So the same like tectonic complexity that produced so much rich natural resource also subjected the whole region to frequent earthquakes, blizzards. Harsh sun also damaged the tiles. And so this necessitated a continual production of replacement tiles. But by the mid-19th century, the Ottoman economy was deteriorating seriously, and the city's trade subdued, major monuments started to fall into very poor repair. And ironically, once again, it was a devastating earthquake in Bursa in 1855 that caused massive damage to that city's many monuments, but it gave some energy to the Kütahya ceramicists. So, think about Armenians in Kütahya. This is like a long standing like Armenian tradition passed down from generation to generation. And think about the interaction with the Ottoman state, which I find really interesting. So we have this green mosque of Bursa, which had a huge opening, crashed into it by this earthquake, and a powerful Ottoman statesman named Osman Hamdi Bey engaged the Kütahya tile makers to make replacement tiles. So in the Ottoman Empire, tiles served a kind of important form of cultural production of material culture, and they linked one generation of ceramicists to the next, to the Anatolian lands, and also to successive dynasties of the Ottoman imperial house. So this statesman we just mentioned, Osman Hamdi Bey, was also a painter and an archaeologist. As a painter, he kind of epitomized this, quote unquote, Orientalist style, this very highly decorative style. He repeatedly advocated support for the Kütahya trade. He argued that it was essential not to neglect the old crafts that had flourished in the 15th and 16th centuries, the time of the empire's greatest expanse and power. And very, very frequently in his paintings, you see tiled revetments in the background. So it has all sorts of symbolic associations. They're meant to recall this time of greatness, but you also see how in these symbols are contained a multitude of people, including Armenians. So Hamdi Bey also included displays of Kütahya where in international expositions in Paris in 1867 and Vienna in 1873. By doing so, he was promoting the trade. He was drawing attention to Kütahya's artistic legacy. So with this help from the capital, with this push, the ceramicists of this period, the third quarter of the 19th century, were working very hard to kind of regain the refined techniques of their ancestors. And of course, unfortunately, as they were focusing on their art, the conditions around them were deteriorating. In 1875, the Ottoman government defaulted on huge debts to Europe. The empire lost territories to the Russians in the 1877-78 war. This also accelerated the migration of Muslims from the lost European and lost Caucasus regions into Anatolia. Some of you may recall that cars went back to Russia after this 1877-78 war. And in the mid-1890s, under Sultan Abdulhamid II, we had horrific Hamidian massacres of Armenians, hundreds of thousands in the eastern provinces and thousands more in Constantinople itself. So these are really challenging demographic changes, and the turn of the 20th century saw this growing Ottoman nationalism. I mean, we saw nationalism all over Europe, but also in the Ottoman Empire, and activists were crying out for more clearly defined Turkish cultural identity. So out of all of these changes and tensions, a new revivalist architectural style emerged that combined distinctive features, once again, of the classical Ottoman and Seljuk monuments, including like domes, wide eaves, pointed arches, and of course, because they could, tiled facades. So in 1904, the government commissioned this grand post office, and all the Kütahya workshops, including Minasyan and Ohannessian, were producing tiles for it. And if you're in Sirkeci in Istanbul today, you will walk past this post office and see the tiles that our ancestors made. Behind the post office was a small mosque that was damaged during construction and reconstructed, and these beautiful tile panels were added in 1910. So as I was doing this research, I kept finding archival traces of my grandfather. Here's one in an Ottoman trade journal. With the founding of his workshop in 1907, Kütahya now had 3 ceramic studios, that of Mehmet Emin, that of the Minasyan brothers, and that of David Ohannessian. And you see those 3 names reflected in this French Ottoman trade journal. And in 1908, the Young Turk Revolution overturned Ottoman dynastic rule. For a brief moment of time, it inspired great optimism with its slogans taken from the French liberty, equality, fraternity, which you see written in Armenian in this plate produced in Kütahya. So during this period, Ohannessian achieved renown for his skill in historic renovations, which all of a sudden became a thing again under the Young Turk, ironically, under the Young Turk government, who decided, oh, we can't let these monuments continue to fall into disrepair. We have these Kütahya workshops, let's put them to work, restoring all these great monuments. When you walk around Istanbul today, you will see the tiles made by the 3 Kütahya studios on these revivalist style buildings. So, I mean, as we're walking through this urban space of Istanbul, we're seeing the legacy of Armenians, Turks, but also Armenians. And on the boat landings, many of the boat landings are decorated with Kütahya tiles. And here, like quite remarkably, in the tomb of the penultimate Ottoman Sultan V, who planned his tomb out in advance and chose the decorations and the architect and all that, So this completed in 1914. You see the work of the Turkish and Armenian tile makers of Kütahya entirely covering this magnificent tomb. And I mean, it's like hard to wrap your mind around the fact that this is 1914. 1 year later, we know what's going to happen. In October of 1911, Ohannessian met somebody who would change the course of his life, a British member of Mark Sykes, about whom we heard a little earlier, traveled to Istanbul on a diplomatic mission, but he made a little detour to Kütahya because he was looking for a ceramicist. Several months earlier, his family's manor in Yorkshire, called Sledmere House, had burned to the ground. And as he rebuilt, he wanted to add a completely grand tiled room in this Oriental style, and he gave Ohannessian this huge commission. After the tiles were installed in early 1914, lots of visitors from Sir Mark's aristocratic social circles, the British Foreign Office, they visited the rebuilt Sledmere House and they admired Ohannessian's work. So this kind of outpouring of success in Kütahya would fade, of course, with the Ottoman entry into the Great War in November of 1914. Pretty quickly in December and January, the first disastrous Ottoman loss in the Battle of Sarıkamış helped turn young Turks' venom on Armenians. The government began rounding up, massacring, and exiling Armenians in the provinces. And of course, as we all know, on the evening of April 24th, 1915, the Young Turk regime arrested more than 200 Armenian luminaries in Constantinople and exiled them to the interior. Later in that year, in December of 1915, Ohannessian himself was arrested and falsely accused of engaging in revolutionary activity. This was always like the excuse that was given, oh, you know, he's causing trouble. We have to arrest him, deport him, or even kill him. My grandfather and their family were deported from Kütahya in early 1916. And like other Armenians from the Western provinces, they followed the rail line to its end in Bozanti, and from there they were placed in caravans and marched through the Taurus and Amanus Mountains to the Arab provinces. So now these photos obviously don't depict my family, but the conditions are very close to what my grandparents described to their children. And during this long forced march, my grandfather contracted a serious case of typhus and almost died. I mean, thank God the family reached Aleppo later in 1916. In December of 1917, British General Edmund Allenby, who we encountered a little earlier, and his army conquered Jerusalem. This brought to an end 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. And Ronald Storrs, who was Mark Sykes's very good friend and had spent a lot of time in Sledmere House and had seen these ceramics, he was installed as the new military governor of Jerusalem. He faced many urgent problems, starvation among residents of Jerusalem, and thousands of arriving refugees. So for Margaret or anyone else who's been to Jerusalem, you see this photo outside the entrance of Surpagop, the convent. These newly arrived refugees are waiting to be admitted. Among these refugees were also thousands of orphans. So beyond the famine, dysentery, malaria, Storrs and his fellow British officers were also confronted with the need to repair the city while respecting the needs of historic preservation. So Ronald Storrs recruited designers and architects from abroad, and he appointed leaders from Jerusalem's diverse religious communities to oversee all the planning that fell outside the scope of a military administration. So in September of 1918, this new pro-Jerusalem society, as it was called, began its duties. And one of its main objectives was to stop the deterioration of the tile work on the Dome of the Rock and to ultimately renew it. So again, Suleiman the Magnificent had recovered the Dome of the Rock in the mid-16th century with Persian tiles. But by the end of the Great War, they were in terrible condition. Like all externally tiled monuments, it required like regular renewal, but Palestine's parched landscape had never had the materials necessary to match the original work. So in the centuries following Suleiman's tiling, artisans would come to Jerusalem, often Armenians from Kütahya would come to Jerusalem carrying the materials with them, make the tiles, put them up, and return to their home regions. So by 1918, we have this influx of British experts, and two of them, Ernest Richmond, architect, and Charles Ashby, designer and architect, were saying, is it going to be possible to keep up this retiling? Who could make tiles? What can we do? Where can we find someone? Because they really didn't know. They started sending out messages, all of which are preserved, like in the British archives, like, can you, one to Lawrence of Arabia, saying, you're in Damascus, can you please check? Is anybody making tiles there? I mean, they were really clueless. Meanwhile, in November of 1918, British Foreign Office mission led Mark Sykes to Aleppo by way of Jerusalem, as we learned, and he passed through Jerusalem, looked at all the buildings, saw the precarious condition of the tiles, because remember, he was attuned to tiles, having created this huge tiled room in his own manor house. So he was in Aleppo interviewing Armenian refugees, and this kind of miraculous accident of fate comes. He's reconnected with Ohannessian. He immediately connects him to Ronald Storrs in Jerusalem. And of course, other British officers had seen the tile work in Sledmere House and agreed when Sykes recommended him to the Pro-Jerusalem Society. This was a document I found in the National Archives in Kew, that's mentioning my grandfather as a possible person to do this work. So the family arrived in Palestine from Syria at the end of 1918. Tavit began experimenting with the local materials. And half a year later, he requested safe transit documents from the British military. He returned to Kütahya to get the clays that he needed and minerals. And when he returned, he brought back with him to Jerusalem Nishan Balyan and Mukdich Karakashian, a potter and a ceramic painter, as well as several other of Kütahya's remaining Armenian ceramicists. And he named his new studio on the Via Dolorosa, the Dome of the Rock tiles. And here's a picture I found in the archive of the Near East Relief Foundation. This is my grandfather on the left with his tarbouche, his fez. And here's a visitor on the right, an American visitor, and they're watching these girls, these orphan girls, learn to paint ceramics. I mean, some of them became like fantastic artists themselves. And speaking of like image projection, image creation, this is a very well-known image some of you might be familiar with. We see young girls painting ceramics in Ohannessian's studio on the Via Dolorosa. But what's much less well-known is that most of these children were orphaned in the Armenian genocide. A number of them took to the art. They remained with him until 1948. And some well-known art historians have dismissed this period of Jerusalem ceramics. I have one of these pieces here, you can see. The art historians, they were very critical of these kind of loosely painted but brilliantly glazed pieces. They didn't recognize who was making them. They didn't recognize that these actually were the products of orphans' children who were striving to learn a craft, a way of sustaining themselves in, conditions of poverty, hunger, enormous loss. Some of them had witnessed the murder of their entire families. And so this very serene looking photograph that we see, and that's so often reproduced and disseminated, actually contains a hidden story of enormous grief. But these girls are pouring themselves into the creation of beauty, which is something I find very, very moving. So Ohannessian and the team also were making replacement tiles for the Dome of the Rock. They did a partial renovation, and he was using, my grandfather, the expertise he gained as a successful workshop owner in Kütahya, applying his flair for marketing to promote his products and develop export channels as he did once before. The Pro-Jerusalem Society gave him some important commissions. One of them was to produce these trilingual street name tiles for the Old City. Another commission was to create a faience model of the Dome of the Rock as a wedding present for the British Princess Mary in 1922. Also in 1922, Balyan and Karakashian left Ohannessian's employ, and they founded their own joint studio outside the Old City on Nablus Road. And this would become Palestine's second Armenian ceramics workshop. So here we see the Ohannessian family in 1923. They're one of many families in Jerusalem, like striving to create a sense of order, to regain some prosperity after the years of war and trauma. And as other families rebuilt their businesses, they also hired local architects to design villas and apartment buildings. And in the 1920s and 30s, Ohannessian carried over to Jerusalem this Ottoman tradition that we saw a little bit earlier of, these external tile embellishments. So he carried that from Western Anatolia, from Kütahya, Constantinople to Jerusalem and introduced it there. Under the British mandatory government, all new construction in Jerusalem was required to be built of the local limestone. And the only permitted exception were these beautiful, colorful tiles. So you see them, you just see them everywhere. And so many of them, of these original tiles, are still in place. So over time, my grandfather continued to rebuild an extensive export network. He distributed his wares through international outlets such as the American Colony stores in Jerusalem and New York and Liberties of London. He participated in international expositions, including the 1932-33 33-34 World's Fair, Paris Exposition of Decorative Arts, Paris Colonial Exposition, like many of these international expositions. He also created monumental tile installations in the Middle East, in Europe, in the United States. And in Jerusalem, he worked very, very hard to preserve the historic Anatolian ceramic making techniques, even in the face of a very different geological environment and the lack of minerals that had characterized this Anatolian ceramics tradition. He designed and executed architectural tile work for new structures designed by British mandate architects. And the most complex of these was a fountain niche of cuerda seca, dry line tile for a new museum, in the 20s and opened in the 30s, designed by Austin St. Barb Harrison, funded by John D. Rockefeller, and intended to display antiquities from the Holy Land. It opened to the public in January of 1938. And here we see a close-up of these tiles. But for me, probably the most personal creation made by my grandfather, the most personally, emotionally meaningful, was this what's a badly damaged memorial altar created in 1928 for the Armenian convent of Saint Savior. And it bears a dedication tile made by him 10 years after he'd first arrived in Palestine as a refugee. And the tile reads, David Ohannessian of Kütahya in the year of the Lord 1919 established the art of ceramics in Jerusalem, and in his workshop prepared the tiles of this holy altar dedicated at the gate of Saint Savior in memory of his parents and all the deceased in the year of the Lord 1928. To the end of his career in Jerusalem, he maintained the use of a traditional wood burning kiln, and he ground glazes from raw materials. He continued to produce pottery and tiles in his workshop on the Via Dolorosa until the beginning of 1948. And one by one, his family fled, scattered to England, Soviet Armenia, Damascus, Cairo, and then Beirut, where he died in 1953. He found his perfect expression in his work, and it has been the honor of my life to tell his story. The joint Balyan-Karakashian workshop continued operating until the deaths of the original partners in the 1960s, and their descendants opened separate workshops. In 1954, the French-Armenian painter Marie Alexandrian married into the Balyan family and introduced like a whole new design vocabulary. She was honored by a solo exhibition at the Smithsonian Museum in 1992, and the Balyan family workshop remains on Nablus Road outside the Old City. The Karakashian family continues to produce very beautiful pottery and tiles. They'll make anything to order that you would like. Their shop is on Greek Orthodox Patriarchate Street in Jerusalem. And then there are other families who've joined in this profession, the Sandrunis, Vic Lepedjan, whose shop is just a few steps from the entrance to the Armenian convent, Hagop Antriasyan, in his shop in the Armenian Quarter on Zion Gate Street. And in 2017, Armenia's Postal Service also celebrated this whole lineage of Armenian ceramics. with a stamp. So before I conclude, I just wanted to share you, as I had said in the beginning, some examples of some new kinds of efforts to preserve Armenian heritage, stories, material culture. Some of these involve experts in their fields. Others are led by individuals who just find themselves with a powerful sense of mission. One of these people may be known to some of you, Liana Aghajanyan, who's documenting Armenian culture through foodways. She will have a cookbook coming out, I guess, next year. Sato Moughalian, who trained as a political scientist, has actually worked relentlessly to keep the destruction of Armenian cultural monuments in Nakhichevan and Artsakh in front of the world's eyes. And he was very nicely aided by Hrag Vartanian, who publishes a very excellent and influential hyperallergic art blog, which I also recommend to you. Not only does he publish this, Simon's story and other Armenian stories, but he covers the issue of cultural destruction and appropriation all over the world, as well as, it's a very embracing blog. It covers like many subjects. It's totally free, hyperallergic. Take a look. The Gomidas Institute in London, under the direction of Ara Sarafian, has been publishing English translations of Armenian texts, especially memoirs. So again, these shed lights on world events from a microhistorical perspective. Project SAVE, which I'm sure all of you know, right? It's right in your neighborhood. Since 1975 has been preserving Armenian photographs, ephemera, and now has embarked on this massive digitization project to make its holdings more accessible and to permit keyword searches, very important. So the renowned Armenian art historian, Dr. Christina Moranci of Tufts University, has developed a very interesting technique for coaxing details from faded Armenian medieval frescoes. She discovered that Photoshop, like you can keep applying Photoshop and Photoshop will like do these sort of, partial reconstructions enough to identify like who's in the icons, sometimes to read inscriptions. So it's a completely original use of new technology. Vahe Tashjan and Silvina Dermugardician developed this Hushamadyan project in Berlin to recreate in virtual space Ottoman Armenian daily life. And Armenian families all over the world who have objects, inherited photos, artisanal works, documents, photograph them, send in the photographs, and Hushamadyan contextualizes them and organizes them according to a point of origin and other pieces of reference. So this is a very, very rich trove of information. It's of value to scholars. It's also of value to anybody who wants to know, like, how did our ancestors live? Like, what did they eat? What dances did they do? What songs did they sing? Because there are a lot of songs now being digitized and added to this, which is beautiful. So this, I think, should encourage more people to share their family memoirs, their microhistories. And for those of you who are interested in documenting your own family's story, possibly even contributing to University of Southern California's digital archive called My Armenian Story, Dr. Salpi Ghazarian and her colleagues have developed a technique for collecting this information, a series of questions. These can be used with Armenians of all ages. I mean, it doesn't have to be the elderly. It can be like any generation, because it's weaving a carpet of our histories, that we hope will continue into the future. And they can also be adapted for other groups. It's a wonderful resource. So these are some of the few extraordinarily valuable projects in the digital space. The AGVU Newbar Library is also doing a big digitization project. I think every single one of you is familiar with the Facebook Armenian Genealogy Group, right? With more than 11,000 members, teams of volunteers, helping people reconstruct their lost family histories from whatever clues remain to them. And finally, just to close, in a remarkable recent development, a new branch of Kütahya-style Armenian ceramics is also taking root in Gyumri, Armenia's second largest city, which has struggled to recover from a devastating earthquake in 1988, in which more than 50,000 died, 100,000 were injured, and where today refugees of Artsakh have taken shelter. So here we see a new generation of young Armenians learning this art. Some of them will continue, and we hope will open professional workshops and export companies of their own. But you see that this art of Armenian ceramics continues to survive and thrive in all kinds of forms, from beautiful handmade artisanal objects to trinkets made in quantities to children's projects. So it's an art that harkens back to the very distant past. It's an art that was almost extinguished in the Armenian genocide, but it persists, as we do, with this vibrant life in Jerusalem and now in Gyumri, Armenia. It's a transformed branch of an old Ottoman tradition. And for me, it's an emblem of Armenian resilience and survival. Thank you.
That was an amazing presentation.
Fantastic.
And before we get into the questions, I just wanted to mention an additional effort. And if Martha would like to just describe briefly Ahari's initiative related to family histories.
We have a new initiative, not so new anymore. It started in July, called Armenian Chronicles, A Living History. And what we want to do is to collect the history of Rhode Island Armenians, particularly to focus on the early immigrants and what their life was like, how they survived the genocide, how they escaped, how they came here, and even why did they come to Rhode Island? What was their life like? What was the life like for their children? What kind of places did they live? And just, we really want to, before we lose it, we've lost so much between the Abdulian, the Hamidian massacres, the genocide, and then even for the early immigrants, just really trying to survive and really building wonderful communities. We're losing our history, and this is our chance to kind of grab it before it's gone. So we hope that we want everyone to participate as much as they can. And you've given us really some wonderful ideas, Sato, in terms of really kind of expanding on some of the things we're doing. It's really, you know what, it's like a blank slate, and we can go in so many directions. It's really fabulous when you think about how Armenians have survived, and not just survived, we have just thrived. It's amazing in spite of everything, really.
Yeah. That's a fantastic sounding project. I'm going to look it up immediately.
Okay.
Yeah.
We haven't documented much, but we're getting there slowly.
No, it's great. I mean, when you think of little Vostanig Manu Adoyan, who showed up, who would one day become Arshil Gorky, who would be this major figure in American art. He arrives in Rhode Island.
It is hard to believe, I think. Yes.
No, I mean, it was an arrival point for a lot of people who ended up becoming very important.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, Helene Binder has one of the ceramics, I think, Sato, and she would like to share that with the group.
Can I share a little bit of my story very quickly?
Sure. Yeah.
My grandparents are Pontic Greeks. My great-grandfather perished in Erzurum, and his sons were forced into labor to march. And my grandmother and her daughters were able to escape to Russia. So we share the same history, the same story. I met my second husband, and his mother had this beautiful piece of pottery that I fell in love with as soon as I saw it. And I asked if someday I could have it. Well, I do. My husband did a little bit of research on it and found out this was hopefully, more than likely.
Whoa.
Wow.
Your grandfather.
I didn't realize how substantial it is.
I didn't think you would think it and realize how big it is.
Wow. Can I see the bottom of it?
And I'm not sure. Let's see.
Oh, yeah.
Can you see that?
Yeah. That looks like a very early piece of Jerusalem pottery, because the design is pure Kütahya. It's pure Kütahya. The fish scales, the medallions, very, very typical of Kütahya. And it's also a little bit unusual that the bottom is glazed, but I think he tended to do that in the earlier pieces. By the 1930s, the bottoms were always unglazed, but that absolutely looks like Ohannessian ceramics, and it looks like an early piece.
Well,
It's so beautiful.
it is. It's amazing, and it's so precious to me because it was precious anyway, but because of your grandfather's story. And what was I going to say? Oh, my husband's grandparents lived in Chicago. My guess is that they may have purchased this at the World Fair. They did.
I bet they did. I bet they
Wow.
did.
But I told my 94-year-old mother, who's first generation in this country, that I was going to meet you on Zoom, and I told her the story, and she cried. So it's just wonderful. It's wonderful to be with all of you.
Oh,
Thank you. very
thank
much.
you.
Really, thank you.
Thank you.
I know we have a question on Facebook, but before I turn that over, Camille?
Yeah, Sato, I just wanted to thank you. I read your book through the Archive Book Club, I think 2 years ago.
Yes, thank
But
you.
Your story is just amazing. I'm so impressed with the research you did. And the pottery is just beautiful. I see a thread in the design and the patterns, like from illuminated manuscripts to rugs. But I was curious, are most of the patterns on the pottery, do you think they're historic, or do you feel that your grandfather also created some of them?
Well, many of them are historic, and also he created a number of them. So for example, I think you saw the photo somewhere of the St. Gregory, or no, St. George and the Dragon.
Yes.
That's in the book, right? That's like inspired by an Armenian like miniature. And that's something that was unique to Jerusalem, because he wasn't, as far as I can tell, I didn't see any evidence that he was using Christian iconography in his Kütahya work. So that was unique. Also, for example, this Armenian bird mosaic. I don't know if you can you see?
Yeah, I can't see it close
There.
up, but I can see it. Yeah.
All right, hang on.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So this is inspired by the mosaic floor that was discovered outside of it's like a 5th or 6th century mosaic floor in a funerary chapel that was excavated in an archaeological dig in 1894 in Jerusalem. And so it's a big floor, and there's an inscription at the top, for the souls of those Armenians, only the Lord knows where they are. This is the 5th century we're talking about this, and it's still like totally resonates today. But he took this design and used it for many, many different types of ceramic ware. I mean, I write about it in the book, but in all different colors and executions. But that's also just Jerusalem. And then various people, like, for example, Austin St. Barb Harrison, who used to spend a lot of time with my grandfather. They worked together on this commission of the Rockefeller Museum. He would come by his studio and draw, and my grandfather would turn the architect's drawings into ceramic ware, some of which are illustrated in the book. The elephant tile, that's
Yeah.
Austin St. Barb Harrison, who was drawing a textile from, I think, the 11th century. So, there's this like weaving and circulating of images and ideas that kept finding their way into expressions as tile.
Yeah.
And of course, in Jerusalem, in the Armenian community, he had like freedom to explore and enlarge his iconography. So it's a combination of the traditional things that he brought with him, and also small changes, big changes, and totally new themes.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's so nice to meet you.
You as well.
Anybody else? Yes, Helene?
I had a question. How much material was your grandfather able to bring back from Turkey to Jerusalem to make his pottery? How long
Well,
did it last?
That's a very good question. That's an excellent question. So what happened is he went back, in late 1919, came back with like huge boxes of clay and other things in the tons. He pretty quickly realized that he needed to save this white clay, this rare white clay, for the tile commissions. And so the tile commissions tend to have like this white clay body. And what he started to do was experiment with the local clay, which was tinged with iron. And you couldn't get a really white background. So what he ended up doing was taking the palette of the Dome of the Rock at that time, that descended from the original Persian tiles, that were decorated in these deep shades of blue. And rather than having a white background like this, he started producing tiles that had a blue background, where you could have this iron tinged clay and it would still work, like you weren't sacrificing anything. So, you see, I don't know if you can see like this clay is pink.
Yeah.
And this clay is white. So he started dividing like that, but he was running out. And in the 1930s, he started importing clay from Turkey. He found an Armenian agent, and the Armenian agent would send him samples, and then he would buy, I found all of his correspondence, tons and tons and tons of it at a time.
Amazing.
So great question.
I have a question about the research that you did. And towards the end of the book, you mentioned that when you went to Turkey, you were able to connect with someone who helped you access the tax records from 1845. I'm just really impressed, because the only census tax records that we've been able to get our hands on has been 1840. And that presents a huge problem, because there's a gap of about, 20 or so, 30 years, a generation between those records and the earliest immigrant records to make those connections. Were you able to do that because you were there in person rather than trying to do it online?
It was they don't have much that's digitized in the Ottoman archives. 9 months searching for a research assistant. I needed a doctoral student or a postdoc in history who was fluent in Ottoman Turkish, who knew how to get around in the archives, because the cataloging system is not the most straightforward. And it took me the full 9 months. I wrote to and also who wouldn't mind working on an Armenian project having to do with the genocide. So it took a long time, but finally a Turkish scholar in Holland, connected me with somebody else who connected me with somebody else, and miraculously a great person emerged. So he was doing research on Kurdish issues, which are also problematic from the Turkish government point of view. I did my on-site research there in 2014. So there was still this brief moment. The coup attempt hadn't happened in the 2016. So, but I had to pass an interview that lasted 90 minutes before they would give me permission to work in the archive myself.
Wow.
And I just said, I'm researching Kütahya ceramics. I mean, once you're in there, they do monitor what you're requesting, but we tried to phrase the requests, the word searches and things in such a way that it seemed to support what I was doing. So I'm not sure I could do it now. I'm not sure I'd be able to get my hands into as much as I can now. And they just scan everything, and they give you these discs with thousands of files on them.
Wow, that's impressive. And then you also had the challenge of doing your research using so many different languages. Yeah. I know you are fluent in a number of languages to begin with.
Not a number of languages. And my Armenian is horrible.
But I mean, Ottoman Turkish and
yeah, I have no familiarity with that at all. So the same research assistant translated the Ottoman Turkish into modern Turkish. So yeah, Yeah, many people helped. I mean, I couldn't have done this without the help of like just a huge number of people, some of whom, as you know, from reading the book, were total strangers who just said, yes, I will help you.
That's
So,
fantastic.
yeah.
Margaret, you said that there is a Facebook question.
Yes, and I have a comment. Thank you, Sato. I had the great privilege of meeting Sato in Jerusalem when she did a book signing at the beautiful American Colony Hotel. Oh my goodness, what a setting. And I've met most of the potters who are there now. They run the little stores. And I hope they're all surviving the lack of tourists.
Okay.
Am I getting an echo or?
No, someone's
Oh, okay.
muted.
All right. The question is from Manu. It has to do with, oh geez, I lost the thing. It had to do with the minerals that were in Turkey versus what there was in Jerusalem.
Mhm.
Oh, I lost it. Oh. Sorry about that. I'm not used to all this, so.
Well, just a lot of the minerals that were the most characteristic elements of the Anatolian ceramics didn't exist in Palestine. You read the book, so at a certain point the British hired a geological advisor. I mean, of course, they were interested in exportable, commodities like oil. They were also interested in water and limestone. And my grandfather pushed his way in and said, you have to research these other, you have to do tests to see if these other things exist. And they, for the most part, they did not. I mean, I think he actually did quite an amazing job of creating a new aesthetic that projected the color scheme of the Dome of the Rock as it was tiled at the time. And so it linked it to Jerusalem. It solved the problem of the clay, like what to do about the clay. And it was partly made with local minerals. So yeah, it was tough. I mean, I think the whole process is very different now because there's so many commercially available things. But I think that, the color, the intensity of color is just not quite the same as when you source and grind your own materials. It's just different. Although, I mean, the current stuff is very, very beautiful, but I mean, there's a reason why you can tell the old ones from the new ones immediately. I'm not sure that answered Manuk's question.
I actually can't even scroll back far enough to see the actual question. I'm using my phone. He also mentioned there's a potter in a school in Kentucky named Marcia Karagosian. Are you familiar with that name?
No.
I wonder if she's connected to the, well, no, it's not quite the same name. Karagosian.
Yeah, Karagosian.
Yeah, it's not quite the same name. That's
I
it.
don't know. I'm good friends with them though, the Karagosians.
I noticed on Facebook, they're actually, I guess to survive, they're having people come in and do their own painting of pottery.
Oh no, they've been doing that for a long time.
Oh, they have?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I wish I'd known that when I was there. I would have tried something.
Yeah. Yeah, next time you go.
Yeah, I
for
hope to
sure.
go back.
Yeah.
You're very, very proud when you go to Jerusalem to see that the Armenian Quarter even exists, how much we have our presences in Jerusalem, and these wonderful, wonderful pottery stores, artists and designs all over Jerusalem.
Yeah.
City and new city. It's absolutely beautiful.
Anyone else?
Any other questions? That was just a comment there. I just want to thank you again for presenting to us and taking the time to speak with us about this, your wonderful book and the art of ceramics. And if no one else has any comments they want to make. Oh, yes, Helene.
Just want to thank everyone for allowing me to join. It was wonderful to meet you, Sato. I would love to meet you in person someday.
I hope so.
Thank
I hope
you.
so, Helene.
I have a question for Helene. How did you know your piece was Armenian? Is there a name on it or?
Well, it said on the bottom, it says made Palestine. And then
Ah.
it had another stamp that's a little smudged. You couldn't make that out. So my husband started looking, and a picture popped up, and it was David Ohannessian. And then we dug a little bit more, and we saw one of the programs you produced. We purchased the book. I have nothing to leave my children because my grandparents had nothing when they came here because everything was taken.
Yep.
But I have this, and I have your book, and it'll stay in my family. This is what. So it was meant to come to me.
That's a beautiful story. I know, because it's like when we don't have, I mean, we also, the only thing basically I inherited, which is the most precious, is, this.
Yes.
Because, they lost everything. They lost everything in a genocide, and then they lost everything again in 1948, so the pottery contains our stories. And the thing is, it's not just the story of like, okay, so you have this piece that you inherited through your family, but the pottery itself contains all these other stories. So,
and it's our family's stories. So
yeah, exactly.
And I have to say this. There's a Greek professor that's doing very much the same thing that you're doing in the Armenian community. He is getting the stories of the children of the Greek genocide, the Pontic Greek genocide in Turkey. And my mother shared a story with him that a woman had called from New York, and she asked for my mother, or my grandmother, and my mother asked her, "How do you know my mother?" And she said she was an Armenian woman who lived in Turkey. She said, "Had it not been for your mother, I wouldn't be here." They snuck her out of the country. So it was my grandmother, her daughters, and this young woman, and they got on a boat and they went to Russia. So it was a story that's very important to me. There's anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm very grateful to all of you who came tonight and for the chance to meet you afterwards. I'm grateful for the opportunity to tell this story.
Thank you.
And also encourage anybody who's interested or who's like can't quite figure out the right Christmas gift for someone. Pick up a
Yes,
copy of the book.
I want to mention again that there's a link in the chat to where you can purchase the book.
Yeah, it's very inexpensive at Amazon. So I'm happy to say.
Sato, thank you so much. This was fantastic. And I hope you'll keep in touch with us, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So
Look forward to your next book.
oh yeah, it'll be a few years, but I'm hard at work.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank you.
everybody.
All
Thank
right.
you very much. Okay, good night, everybody. Kashet,
Good
buddy.
night.
Kished Pari Kished.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.